This video is going to look at the top 6, in my opinion, physical features of Kenilworth Castle. Now, this is so important for your exam because remember, every single question you get and the 2 questions you're going to answer, whatever they are, will ask you to use physical features. Every point you make needs to link back to a physical feature because it's going to help to support your answer. So if we look at these 2 examples quickly, whatever the question is, whether it's about why people first created Kenilworth, whether it's about how diverse activities and people have been, whatever point you are making, whenever you're explaining your views, your evidence comes from the physical features. So you need to walk into your exam really clear about a series of physical features that you can talk about. So here are 6 which you can make sure you're ready for. First of all, some buildings from the military era. We're going to look at the Great Tower, the very first physical feature which is built at Kenilworth. We're going to think about the Mere, a military defensive feature. And then we'll look at the Outer Curtain Wall, which of course is useful for thinking about the ruins era as well as the military one. And then we'll look at 3 palatial structures, the Great Hall, Leicester's building, and finally the Elizabethan garden. Now, of course, there are more physical features. Well done for doing your own revision and going away and preparing other buildings you can talk about. But if you can talk about these 6, then you are in a pretty good place as well. So let's go through each of these separately. So we'll start with the Great Tower or Keep. Now, this was built by Geoffrey de Clinton around 1124, 900 years ago, and the stone keep, which we can still see today, replaced an initial wooden one. This wouldn't have been possible without the support of King Henry I, and remember, King Henry I is concerned about the Earl of Warwick living nearby, and so gives the land and a position of power to Geoffrey de Clinton, and Geoffrey de Clinton constructs this strong stone tower. We always want to have some details of features of each of the buildings we talk about because they reveal things to us. So when we look at this tower and when we visited it, we could see that there are these extremely thick walls, 4.3 meters thick, and that really reveals to us the importance of having a strong defensive structure. This really suggests that Kenilworth is built with a kind of military function. The Great Tower was developed over time, including some palatial developments. So what we can see today includes some bigger windows on the 2nd and 3rd floors. Now, this can be one of the challenges of studying Kenilworth because it's hard to know what was built when and how things developed over time. If we just look at this building now, we can think, well, there are these big window places, how can it be military? But of course, those were built and renovated later on. When we look at the physical remains that are still there today, we can find evidence for a well for water, latrines or toilets, and we can see where the spiral staircases were, which led up to a great hall. So this helps us to understand that it was a place that the owners lived in, like Geoffrey de Clinton, as well as being a military feature. So we can look at this building and we can think and understand a bit about the way people lived back when it was first built. Moving on, let's think about the Mere. So the Mere is a really interesting one because it's there from the beginning, developed by Geoffrey de Clinton, but it's then extended massively by King John. So we can think about this site being a place which is always changing, and we can think about the reasons for those changes. Of course, we know King John was in a very weak position and wanted to make the castle virtually impossible to attack. And that's achieved in large part by this Mere, which basically creates a kind of one side of it that's really hard to get to. The Mere can be useful if we're trying to think about why Kenilworth was built exactly where it was. Why did they choose that site? And the nearby rivers, as well as the natural valley, were identified as an easy to kind of flood and create this Mere. So that helps us to understand and explain the exact location. The Mere is useful for defensive military purposes. It helps us to understand the military era, but also it was used for fishing, water for living. And so this can help us to think. It shows that there are many people there. There's big requirements for water sources, for fishing, and that helps us again to think about what was going on at the castle at the time. It also reveals how worried King John was, how much danger he was in. And if we want to link it to a major event, we can think about the role the Mere played during the Great Siege in 1266. It was a big reason why the king's army was kept outside and wasn't able to break down the defences of the rebels. On to our final military feature, and if we look at this image of Kenilworth, we can see the outer curtain wall going all the way around the castle. And that's the final one we're going to think about for the military era. Now, this is developed by King John, roughly around the years 1210 to 1215. So he's taken control of the castle, and it's one of the castles across England that he is using, investing huge amounts in. So we know around £1,100 developing the defensive strength of Kenilworth. And we can really use that to think about what England was like. It reveals to us what was going on at the time. It can also help to explain why Kenilworth is changing. The king really needs to use the castle to shore up his power. The outer curtain wall is included within the Mortimer's Tower, Lund's Tower. So those are parts of the wall. And each one of those we could talk about separately as well. Of course, especially Mortimer's Tower, the very strong gateway leading into the castle. Again, we can link the outer curtain wall to the Great Siege of 1266. It helps the rebels to keep the king's army out. Of course, the outer curtain wall was then slated, or bits of it were, by the parliamentarians. So if we want to talk about the Civil War, the turning point of that, when Kenilworth becomes a ruin, we can use the outer curtain wall to show and explain that, and we can still see where it was destroyed today. Having said that, we also get a great benefit from visiting the castle, a benefit from studying this site, because we can still see parts of the castle, parts of the wall which are as tall and strong today as when they were originally built. When we go there, we can see its height, we can see its strength, and it can really help us to understand how the castle functioned. Here's just an image of the castle being slated. And remember, the parliamentarians wanted to end castles being used by the royal family, stop them being used in a military capacity to oppress the English people. And we can tell the story of that through looking at the outer curtain wall as well. Going back then to the end of the military era, here's an image of the siege. We can see the king's army trying to get into the castle. They weren't able to get in, of course, but the rebels in the end gave up, were forced to leave the castle. And this was the turning point which led Kenilworth from being a military castle into being more of a palatial one. So we're going to move on to our three palatial structures. The first one, which you're going to talk about in your exam, is the Great Hall. This is built by John of Gaunt, not to be confused with King John, in around the 1370s and 80s. It's built as this huge status symbol. The Great Hall really reveals to us the way that Kenilworth's uses had changed. Let's think about the kind of activities and people we can link to the Great Hall. Well, it would have housed these great feasts with the rich, the famous, the powerful of England and beyond coming to enjoy this space, as well as these kind of musicians, entertainers. We can link it to the huge kitchen, which is developed at the same time, which could feed hundreds of people. And all of these things help to reveal the values, the attitudes, the things people enjoyed. We can still get evidence of the high ceiling, the beautiful windows, the fireplaces, and we can see where the tapestries, the expensive tapestries, would have hung. Having said that, the Great Hall is perhaps a good example of talking about some challenges of studying a site. Here is a building which was so grand back in the day, but now it's in ruins. So it can be challenging to study today, as the ruins only give hints of what it was like before. And so it can be difficult for us to see its full glory. On to our final two buildings then. So our fifth top feature is Leicester's building. This was the building built by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, in the 1570s, and it's built for Queen Elizabeth I. Now, Why is Kenilworth changing? Why are these new additions being made? Well, this is an act of love on Robert Dudley's part, but of course it's also a display of wealth and his status and culture. So Kenilworth is being used to display these things. It's the size of a large country house. It's got the private dance hall for Elizabeth. It's got her beautifully decorated bedroom. We can still see evidence of that today with the markings in the walls and the fireplace. And it would have been full of expensive furnishings from all around Europe. We can again still see today the large windows, and we have descriptions of how this building kind of glistened with the lights pouring in. We know that Queen Elizabeth brought a group of around 400 staff on her royal visit of 1575, and many of those would have stayed in the building too. So if we think about the question of how diverse of the people and activities associated with Kenilworth been, we can think of them, we can link it to this building. Here we see an image, a drawing of what Leicester's building would have looked like in the time of Elizabeth's visit, and we can see some of the decorations here. This is a good example of how artists have used the ruins and used the current physical remains to develop their own images and recreations of what this may have looked like. Our final physical feature then is the Elizabethan garden. Great one to talk about for both the palatial era and for tourism. This again was built by Robert Dudley, developed by Robert Dudley in the 1570s, and it's just a perfect example for showing that Kenilworth at this time is palatial. It's not for war. It would have been full of beautiful plants, including rare and foreign ones. It's got the aviary, the birdhouse, and this reveals to us the fashions of the time, but also helps to explain and reveal to us expanding trade networks and how valued these were. If you wanted to show off, having foreign birds, foreign plants would all have shown your kind of high status in your culture. Now, the garden as we see it, of course, isn't the original garden, and it was recreated at huge cost in 2009 by English Heritage. And that really helps us to think about the nature of Kenilworth as a modern tourist site, and to think about some of the changes and some of the ways that the castle is useful for us today to still go to see, to imagine. It's also a challenge, though, because we need to take into account that this has been recreated and won't be exactly the same, of course, as what it would have been like in Robert Dudley's time. So those are our top 6 physical features. You will almost certainly be able to use these, whatever questions come up in your exam. Let's go through a very quick recap then. So for the military era, beginning in the 1120s with Geoffrey de Clinton, we can talk about the Great Tower, or we can call it the Keep. We can talk about the Mere. Moving on to King John's time, so that's around 1215. We're going to talk about the Outer Curtain Wall, and we can see there Mortimer's Tower, we can see here Lund's Tower, and we can think about the extension of the Mere. Into the palatial era, and we've got John of Gaunt, around 1370 to 1400, and his beautiful Great Hall, and just next to it and all underneath it, the kitchen and the place for the servants. And then finally, moving on to Robert Dudley's era, the 1570s, we see the Elizabethan garden here, we see Leicester's building over here. So there you go. Make sure that you're really clear what physical features you're going to be talking about. Make sure you've got thoughts about the details of each one. And in your exam, just make sure that whatever point you make, you link it to a feature and you explain how that feature helps to support whatever the point is that you are making.